So, welcome to True North Radio with your host, Brandy Kerignan from the Battlefords on Treaty 6. We're joined by Misa
That's right.
Nikolic, mayoral candidate for the upcoming North Battleford municipal election to take place Monday, November 9th, 2020. Misa lives in North Battleford, has recently held posts managing our historical archives and held posts in the arts heritage sectors for 3 decades.
Mm-hmm.
So just to give some context to the first question, so the provincial elections are returned to status quo in terms of how to approach social policies. So with municipal elections unfolding, I think we're beginning to see a paradigm shift in how to approach social issues. Especially now, like how to shape social issues, because the atmosphere is one of like growing economic uncertainty that we're all feeling during a global pandemic. So you're coming to the stage, social issues top of the agenda.
Yes.
And if you could elaborate on, I read an article and it was either Battleford's Now or it was one of our regional papers. 44 decades of the same strategy.
Yeah.
So looking at that, in what ways would you be moving us into a more progressive or a different trajectory to start dealing with the social issues connected to crime, of course, violence?
Well, first of all, traditionally, we tend to view crime as a problem related to bad individuals, and we lay the blame for crime on the individual. And to a degree, that's true. People do have to be held responsible for their actions. But the kind of crime that we're seeing, which is a stream of activity over many decades across the prairies, this is a symptom of other problems that we're not addressing. It's not the root cause of our problems. Crime isn't the problem that's preventing us from having a better image. It's our social problems that are resulting in crime, as well as high levels of homelessness, addictions, and other issues. In talking to a lot of the younger candidates seeking council positions, they're all very much in agreement here. They all see these connections. They all see that all these issues are interconnected. Now, we've seen in the States a lot of violence recently, a lot of police-related violence. There's a movement to defund the police. And certainly what happened in Minneapolis, there's a movement to disband the police. I'm not a proponent of that here. I think our situation is different. And the police do have a role to play because crime does occur. And what's happening in Minneapolis right now is there's been a huge spurt in crime because the police have been basically forced to stand down. So you do need them. We have a gang problem. It's a regional problem. And the RCMP are the best suited to deal with that because the fact that they are the RCMP. If it was a local PD, there would be communications issues, there would be integration issues. But when I say it's a regional issue, I mean, these are gangs that moved into the region from Regina and in previous decades from Winnipeg, where those old policies and viewpoints just pushed them out as undesirable people without dealing with the core problems. And now we've inherited that. So I saw, in the archives, that this was already an issue, an election issue back in 1985. And Grant Warnock was elected partly on a platform of tough on crime, more policing. And that's always been the case. So clearly we need to deal with other aspects of the problem. So other municipalities have had similar issues and dealt with them successfully. It seems to me the most obvious thing is you would examine those issues very carefully. How did those cities manage it? What were their strategies? How did they get other levels of government on board, other organizations, and try to replicate that success here? It's worth a phone call or two, and it's worth looking up some public records. Medicine Hat, of course, is the example that everyone keeps bringing up. They solved homelessness, but they chose to characterize their social issues as a homelessness problem, not as a crime problem. And they brought forward a multi-pronged strategy, real housing, not just overnight beds, counseling in the form of job counseling, family counseling, addictions counseling. They brought in all kinds of programs to help the neediest citizens of their city, to make them productive. And when you provide those resources, people tend to respond very positively, totally against stereotype. Another article I read recently, Toronto, also with a huge homeless problem. In 8 months, they built 1,000 residential units for the homeless. Again, not just beds, but actual residences. And they partnered with a private corporation to do this. And I mean, it can be done. Why aren't we doing it? Now, Medicine Hat took the viewpoint, and this was a few years ago when they were starting to look into it, that they looked at the numbers, they crunched the numbers, and they found out that it was going to be cheaper and therefore better for the taxpayer to provide all these services and help people instead of abandoning them to the healthcare system and the criminal justice system. So isn't it wonderful when your morality and your finances match? That's great. Also kind of sad that that's what it took to do it, but how much more sad is it that we see it can be done and aren't following suit?
Mm-hmm. No, I that makes so much sense as a long-term resident that it can be done. How are we going to get it done? I suppose to say that we have a lot of evidence, we have a lot of research, and I suppose what can you do to, like you're saying that the youth are participating more, which is a great sign,
It is,
you know, to get that input. But it's like, how does one, I guess, with the status quo, I mean, I'm sure it's safe to say you are the outsider candidate in this affair. And so, like, how does one get the message across, like, sort of revivify the idea that, you know, this is a small rural town. This is totally doable.
Mm-hmm.
And I like you're kind of throwing in there, like, is it the narrative? Is it how we're framing how to commence with dealing with the social issue, with dealing with the root rather than the, you know,
yeah,
symptoms, I suppose.
I mean, even, you know, like our population numbers have been in question. Officially, it's about 13,000. I've heard people say it's about twice that much. But even if that's true, Medicine Hat has a population of 50,000. Look at how big Toronto is. So, yeah, I mean, the numbers, I mean, obviously are. On the other hand, I also read very recently that crime is now a problem throughout Saskatchewan, and that nationally, Saskatchewan has got a serious problem here. So, you know, our issues are regional, and I think the key here is the relationship building with other organizations. And none of the other candidates are villains here. You know, I don't want to cast a bad light on anybody. So some of this is already known to them, and some of the relationship building has started. For example, there's an organization called the Battleford Community Coalition, which constitutes the mayors of the town and the city, as well as 5 local chiefs. So this is a great start. This is a platform for the community leaders to talk about regional issues and to have a common platform with which to approach the provincial and federal governments or other organizations. This is a wonderful start. It's going to take more. I don't know too much about the details or history of how Medicine Hat or other communities achieved their goals, but I know it can be done. And though the groundwork has been laid, it's just a matter of moving forward on it. Now, why would I be better for this than other people who have been working on this already? I'm not a businessman. I'm not a career politician. Mm-hmm. I'm someone from the arts and heritage and culture sector, I guess. But I do have administrative experience. And what I bring to the table that others don't is I have the sociological and cultural knowledge to understand these issues. So we talk a lot about reconciliation. And my view, coming from the world of academia, is that white people have become very comfortable with a certain level of reconciliation. We know to change our email signature or start our speeches with a land acknowledgement, but that's it, you know. And those are good things because it makes it visible, but it doesn't constitute action.
Right. It's very much we live in a political landscape of platitudes,
Yes.
without the check signed and sent. So
Yeah.
yeah, without the direct action, it's difficult to believe it is anything more than a platitude.
Yeah.
So yeah, no.
So, I mean, some of the things I've heard from a couple of the candidates in particular have been terminology that's just borderline racist.
Uh,
And
I
I'm not trying to
agree.
call anyone out here because it's not intentional, right? But my view on racism is that it's mostly unconscious, right? Most racism isn't angry people in the street denouncing somebody. It's ordinary people who don't think they're racist exercising privilege blindly. And I see this happening when I hear terms like generational crime. This is a mishmash of intergenerational trauma, which results in crime. Only by characterizing it as generational crime, you're once again throwing it back onto the individual instead of seeing it as a social problem. So going back again to what I bring to the table, I know that I'm going to have some blind spots. I'm not a businessman, even though I come from an entrepreneurial family. I would chose not to follow that route in my own life. And at least one person said, "Oh, welcome to the communist regime." Well, geez, even if I was a communist, we have a lot of business and finance people in the administration, and they're not going anywhere. So even if by some miracle you got a communist elected, and I'm not, but I'm a social democrat through and through.
Yeah.
Um, those people still have a voice, and they're still going to be heard, but at least there's going to be a different conversation happening because right now the business and finance interests are driving policy. You know,
True, and drowning out the language of, I'd say, persons who have recently followed, like Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont.
right?
There's almost a burst of new political energy and new political terminology of how can we get on the same page without that adversarial.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's I'm happy to see her running, and I'm happy to see that there's a lot of action going on with people being interested for once in the municipal election.
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, having different comments and having like a lot of energy swirling in Regina, Saskatoon. Like I know Saskatoon, there's a climate action group who are very staunch at making their concerns known.
Mhm.
And like you say, I think I'm hoping like seeing you run is delightful for me. I've lived here for a long time, and like seeing the young people, uh it's like invigorating. And yeah, hopefully, like you say, with relationship building, there's many places in North Battleford I feel that you could reach out and form those meaningful bonds that you need to trust to. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's true what business, pro, small business, and which is great, but it
Mhm.
can't be the only thing on the platter. And that's what I'm seeing. And
I mean, I would
and
love to help small business and local business, and I'm not sure what that would look like, except that ultimately it's going to cost the taxpayer. But the city has offered some minuscule help for businesses that have suffered during the pandemic or who were forced to close. But it's so minuscule that if a business is actually facing permanent closure, it's not going to make a difference. And those are the ones I'm most concerned about, the ones that are on the verge of just disappearing. Mayor Bader's very proud of the 20 businesses that opened since he's been elected mayor, but we
Right.
could lose 20 as a result of the pandemic if we don't act. And it's foolish to think coming through a pandemic with a 3 month closure of most of our shops that we're not going to suffer economically and that we're not going to be back in the red at least a little bit. It's
Well,
great that they're paying down the debt, but my attitude is that when you elevate the fiscal concerns of the city above the fiduciary ones, of which it's only a part and not the whole, then what you're doing is that you're imposing business thinking on government, private sector thinking on the public sector, and
yeah,
then you
true.
end up judging your success by the wrong metric.
No, it makes very, very well said. Yeah. And yeah, like what I feel with the pandemic is um, I heard one of my favorite lecturers say a lot of leaders who are accustomed to leading before the pandemic are now in a state of a bit of a scramble because they're not. So he described it as running as in cartoons when Wile E. Coyote is running, but he doesn't look down.
Yeah,
He's still running. Physics is happening for him. But as soon as he looks down, I mean, you drop and you fall. And I think with the pandemic, that we really, truly need a strong shift in how we are looking at problems
yeah,
because those problems that were fine when you were on the cliff are not real fine now. Like, yeah. So it's great to have someone to talk to, locally who's running municipally, who cares, obviously, about the city to shift those conversations.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
The pandemic has thrown a very sharp light on these social issues. I mean, if you look at the federal government's response, they tried to work very quickly to help people that were going to lose their jobs. Um, and inevitably, people were going to get left out of that. And their attitude was, let's just get money in people's hands and we'll work out the bugs as we go. Otherwise, the bureaucracy takes over and it's too late. Um, I was one of many people that lost my job for a few months, and I got funding right away. And as soon as it was over, I got hired back. So financially, I wasn't affected at all. But I know a lot of other people were,
Yeah.
um, and
Mm-hmm.
there was really nothing for them. And my habits started changing. I started ordering more online because I couldn't go to shops. But then I wasn't eating out as much, so probably my overall spending didn't change. Um, but then in terms of elections too, because of the social distancing and so forth, there's been an effect there as well. Like you said, with like people that were already established politicians, they're having trouble
Right.
adapting to the new
And yeah.
technology. So people that are really good face to face in person aren't necessarily as keyed into this sort of engagement online. Now is the age of the introvert. So
Welcome.
yeah,
I
those
welcome
people
you.
like this are
Yeah.
doing well. So I knew from the very get-go that my campaign would not include canvassing. I mean, if I encounter people in the street, inevitably I will. Of course, I'm going to talk to them, but I haven't rung a single doorbell yet. But I've got a flyer or a brochure in every single house in the city, or I will by the end of the week. I've got newspaper ads, I've got the social media, I've got interviews. If there's anybody by November 9 who doesn't know who I am and what I stand for, um, well, they must be living on the other side of the river.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited by this campaign. I'm happy, my mom who is uh, a little politico grandma herself. When seeing social issues elevated is something that I think a lot of people, whether you hear it or not, is that's on their mind,
Mhm.
and it's something that I know in my family, like my family, my cousin, like Saskatchewan is we were born here. This is where my family is. Like we're very concerned. Uh, social issues are not being approached, and the level of violence in the rural areas and the level of economic instability is something that I know that a lot of my family and a lot of people that I know like do not want to see.
Yeah.
And know that, yeah, if you have to spend more now, there's a huge return later.
Oh, absolutely.
And we live in that kind of a political landscape too, pre-COVID, where it very much get rich fast.
Yeah.
We're going to invest just this much. We're going to see this turnover with very little regard to how that was going to empty the coffers of the perhaps those who aren't involved in that pro business, private sphere dealings.
Mm-hmm. And when you talk to the current mayor or other administrators in the city today, they very much do give the lip service to these social issues, but their actions show that it's paying down the city's debt that has been their priority all along. And they've made a lot of progress there. But at the same time, carrying debt is not a moral failing if
No.
you manage it well. And when you inherit that debt from a previous government, you're not really responsible for it. You didn't generate it, but you still have to kind of assume responsibility. But at this point, as somebody who has worked for the city, I can see that a lot of non-essential services have been cut or undermined for the sake of paying down the debt, and even to the point where some of our revenue streams are being damaged. And this is very short-term thinking for short-term gains. So this is the business thinking again, which tends to prioritize the short term, even
Right.
if it does talk about long term. I don't see it in action. So I mean, that's a gap, or that we need to kind of address. The debt is important. It does need to be paid down. I don't want to raise taxes, any more than anybody else does. Um, but I would favor a small increase if it was necessary, just as I would favor a small increase to our debt if it was necessary. We got to provide services. We have to deal with these social issues, and that is the purpose of government, not to make money. That's the private sector. And if you're coming into government with, business thinking in mind, it might be time to kind of bracket that and think about the larger picture.
Yeah, I agree. It's it's good to hear from a different perspective on this. And one more question I wanted to ask you for.
Yeah.
So you had worked in arts and heritage and academia, and you're coming from this sort of place, which is like seeing the austerity coming in, like the austerity on public services, on public, like Churchill said, like, what are we fighting for then?
Yeah.
Like if there's nothing for us to explore, and if you think humans are made to pay debt,
Yeah.
and there's nothing left for us, like bringing that, having, I guess, like you're saying, like a broader or a more, not complex, but like just as a larger sociological, I guess, map
Mm-hmm.
of society, that like these are things that are important. And I think these are things that when we have less of these things, you do see more violence.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, David Gillen brought up a very good point. We were talking to the Rotary Club yesterday, and he's a proponent of more social activities for children and youths. Absolutely. But in context with a lot of other stuff. And this is the person who was talking about generational crime. He's right about getting kids active and keeping them engaged in productive groups. And we could definitely be doing a lot more of that in terms of sports, in terms of arts, in terms of culture. And it's important in terms of the gang problem to get kids who are exposed to crime before they choose that life. Because once they have, you've lost them. The usual policing deterrents of fines and incarceration are no longer effective at that point. So that is important, but when I talk about coming from the arts sector, what people who aren't in that sector don't realize is that everything we do is political by nature. You know, as somebody who's studied art history, that means I've studied actual history, sociology, psychology, political science, philosophy. It overlaps so many other fields, and we share so much of the same literature. And even as a practicing artist, art is inherently political in Western civilization and has been for centuries. So I'm very much attuned to political things, and I always want to unpack things when I don't like to just accept things by example. So if I could like bring things back to your original thoughts about the provincial election, this was preceded and followed through with a lot of slogans like strong leadership, from Scott Moe's Saskatchewan party. And I kept thinking to myself, I saw this on billboards everywhere. What does that mean? I don't know what it means.
Yeah, indeed. How obtuse. How
I mean,
vague.
does it mean that you have an agenda and you're going to stick to it? Does it mean you're not going to listen to naysayers? Does it mean that you've got the numbers to push your agenda through? I don't know. So then I thought, well, who are some strong leaders, right? Well, the first one that pops in my mind is Hitler. Hitler was a strong leader. Genghis Khan was a strong leader. But then on the other hand, Churchill was a strong leader. Abraham Lincoln was a strong leader. It's a vague enough term that it can mean anything and it can be applied anywhere on the political spectrum. And I think that's the key to understanding it here. It's what we in academia would call a floating signifier. You apply meaning to it because it's empty of meaning. And I think that that's a strategy that the Saskatchewan Party has put in place in their campaigning. I personally prefer smart leadership, and that means you bring your expertise to the table, you acknowledge your biases and your blind spots, and you seek out and do the research for those areas. And smart leadership isn't as sexy, it doesn't sell as well, but I think it's what's needed. And I think this is the attitude I'm seeing with a lot of the young people. And when I say young, we're talking about people in their 20s and 30s who are running for council. And in fact, we have a guy in his early 20s running for the mayoral race as well. I mean, this is really exciting. And the conversations are happening that haven't been happening before that we really, really needed.
Oh, yeah. For a long-term resident, this is the most exciting municipal election North Battleford has ever seen. Yeah, it's great. We covered a lot of stuff in late 2016. We covered the STC wind down and sell off.
Yeah.
We were there for that. And it's just a return to the same. I appreciate your signifier comment because it is hard to nail down what are they saying and why does it appear adversarial, and why do I too as an artist want to attack them in an adversarial way, because it's almost like they're creating that for me to do. But you can see how it's used along the spectrum to really not address evidence-based research that can and will help us. Yeah, no, this is a very strange times.
It is, and this is one of the things in my platform is that I want to have data-driven decisions, and I got this from my experience with project management. It's so easy to make decisions based on assumptions, and those assumptions can turn out to be wrong, and this is when businesses fail. But do the research, find the data. You define the scope of work. This is a step a lot of people skip. You define the reporting relationships so that all the stakeholders are included in communication. These are things that the city's not doing. One candidate spoke about bringing in a public relations firm to improve our image. And that's one approach. It could work, but we could also earn that better image by addressing the root problems. We could also hire a marketing and communications coordinator and a graphic designer to actually take charge of the city's communications and to build a brand, which right now is just subject to negative news reports. they don't have anyone on staff who's doing any of this. And the expertise is there. Um, Even in terms of things like reconciliation, we have staff who have expertise in these areas, and they're not being utilized. So, some restructuring I think needs to be done. There are definitely some seats that are being filled with wages that are very much out of step with the work that's being performed. Not across the board, but there's at least 2 or 3 heads I think that are inevitably going to roll. But with a couple of councillors retiring and a lot of dissatisfaction with the current mayor, I think whoever gets in, there's going to be change. Even if I don't win the election, there's going to be change. And these conversations are going to happen. So from that perspective, I'm very excited about this as well. And I'm very glad that I've been able to kind of contribute something to the discussion.
Oh, yeah, it's very different for North Battleford, and it's really delightful. And I'm seeing so much across the province. Like myself and my partner, we've been doing art for 2 decades. There was a time when my partner and I were in an art workshop hosted on top of City Hall. It was upstairs, beautiful lighting, perfect for painting, and just feeling like, yeah, the beginnings of creating community have always been there. And like you say too, we can still revisit and reimagine those things that have taken place in the last couple of, decades here.
Yeah.
To create those bonds, especially with the youth. Kids just love music and the arts.
Yeah.
For verbalizing or bringing into manifestation how we feel, what we are, what we need to do. But yeah, this is exciting. Thanks for tuning in with us. We're kind of used to running with a camera and harassing public officials with our camera, which you can't really do anymore.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is nice. And we've been doing this for a few years, and we are just so excited because there's just, like you say, there's so many more new voices adding.
Mm-hmm.
And young people who understand the web of social, the web in which we live our lives, in which we are all connected, and they really imbue that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, everyone I think kind of agrees that the status quo doesn't work anymore, and we really got to reevaluate priorities. Yeah.
Indeed, and having that kind of framed as these people over here are a bit radical, or being considered a bit like, why is that ma'am out there yelling in her megaphone, and what like having that feeling like, simmer down now. It's like, well, it's a little difficult to simmer down when cutting bus services or cutting public services can lead to violence.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of violence that I'm glad is being addressed more. It's the violence of removing public services, the violence of leaving people with nowhere to go. And that's a form of violence I'm glad I'm seeing addressed with your campaign. And this, like I say, this is the most exciting municipal election that we've ever seen. Yeah. So I'm glad to do this. I'll be, we'll be working to get it up. So
great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you. Yeah. And hopefully we'll meet again.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and post election and see. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Misha.
That's right.
Thank you again, and we'll work on getting this up.
All right.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.